friends? Welcome to the Let Go, Let God podcast. I'm your host, Erika Ray, and we are back for week 5 of our Top Leaders in the Bible series. So, I mentioned in the last episode that I did not post the week prior because I was not feeling good. And so today, well, technically tomorrow because it's Tuesday, but Wednesday is when I launch both episodes. So you're going to get a 2-for-1 special. So make sure you listen to both episodes, week 4 and week 5. We're talking about Nehemiah in the last episode and then Joseph in this episode, which I'm so excited. I have been preparing for this podcast for days because there's so much to unpack in Joseph's story. We are going to be going through a lot of chapters, over 10 chapters. So we're going to be focusing on Genesis 37 through 50. So there's a lot of ground to cover in this, but I'm really excited. I will start with some updates. Again, as I mentioned, I don't do too much, but this morning when I'm recording, it's actually Veterans Day, so I didn't have to work, which is super nice. So me and my husband went on a hike this morning, and then there's this pastry place that's right next to our house that apparently has similar pastries that are sold in Paris. One of our friends told us about it, and so we went this morning. I got a chocolate croissant, and Kaden got a ham and cheese croissant, and they were really good. So we'll definitely be going back. So that was our little excursion this morning, and now he's studying, and I was prepping, and now I am recording, obviously. So other than that, I did say on the last episode that I was doing something and I couldn't talk about it if you watched it, but now I can talk about it. So I went to Arizona on Saturday with my best friend and then her boyfriend and Kaden. And if you haven't been to Arizona, it's really cool. You drive through these roads and they have deer and bison and bears and wolves. And then the second half of it is like a zoo that you walk around, and I got to see the baby otters, which are my favorite. But it was really fun. It was such a fun day. And then we went to the park. Well, not really the park. It was this off the trail spot that Casey's boyfriend really liked. And so we all went there to have a picnic, and he proposed to her. So that was so exciting because now my best friend is engaged, and Kaden and Garrett are really, really good friends. So it's really cool because her and I, we always prayed that our future men would become best friends, and they are, and now they're engaged. And then after Arizona, we drove back down to Phoenix because that was out in Williams, which is near Flagstaff, Arizona. And we had a surprise engagement party set up for her, which was so fun. So it was a really fun weekend. And then we had our other friends over the next night to have dinner and games. We've been on a categories kick lately. If you guys have never played that game, it's so fun. I just want to play it every night. I'm such a big game person. I love a good game. I think it's because me and my brothers, we played a lot whenever we were growing up. So I love to play games. But anyways, it was such a jam-packed weekend. It was so fun. And then it was so nice having today off because it's not even 12 o'clock yet. And I'm recording this episode, so I still have the whole rest of the day to do whatever I want. And then I just have work this week, and we have small group. And then Saturday is my bridal shower, which I think I talked about previously, but I'm really excited about that. And so just so many fun things to come with the holidays. And then now my best friend is engaged, so we can start planning her wedding and all of the continued and finishing touches for my wedding in December. And then me and Kaden actually just booked a trip to Flagstaff right after the wedding. That's going to be our second little honeymoon trip. It'll be really fun because we're going to go around New Year's so we can see the pine cone drop. So they do this really cool thing. You know how New York does the ball drop? They do a pine cone drop. So we'll get to go over there, and then they'll still have it all set up for Christmas. So that's going to be really fun. So lots of things coming, and I'm really excited. And it also reminds me that I need to stay on my podcast game because I'm on a 5-week series. We're halfway through, 5 more weeks till Christmas, I believe. Is that right? I don't know if that's right. Anyways, I was going to do 5 more weeks, and I think this was going to lead us up until Christmas, so it might be right. Or my math is terribly wrong, which is not good because I used to be a math tutor. But, anyways, let's get into the story of Joseph because we have a lot to unpack. This is definitely one of my favorite stories in the Bible. It is just filled with so many great lessons, and I can't wait to get into them. So, as mentioned before, we're going to get into Genesis 37 through 50, so we've got a lot of ground to cover. Joseph was a man who went from being a slave to being Pharaoh's right-hand man. His key traits were integrity, wisdom, forgiveness, and faith. So, we'll get right into the story. Joseph's father, Jacob, loved him more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And Jacob had 12 sons in total, and Joseph was his favorite. And so he was gifted from his father a coat of many colors. And his was really special because it was long sleeved, ankle length, and colorful. Mostly everybody had a coat, a robe, or a cloak, but they were all usually knee length, short sleeved, and plain. So Joseph got this luxurious coat. So think of it as, a lot of women have purses, but you see the women who have Louis Vuitton or Gucci or Coach purses, and you're like, okay, they got the good stuff. And so that's kind of how Joseph's coat was. So because of this favoritism, Joseph's brothers hated him. So Joseph told his brothers about a dream he had where they were all out in the field tying up bundles of grain, and suddenly Joseph's bundle stood up, and all the brothers' bundles gathered around and bowed before Joseph. They were told about this dream. Joseph let them in on this dream, and they hated him even more because of this dream. They were like, that is crazy. We don't ever want that to happen. No. So he also had another dream where the sun, moon, and stars bowed before him. And Joseph actually told his father about this dream. And his father was curious as to what the dreams meant. And then his brothers were just furious about these dreams because obviously Joseph is at a higher position than they are in these dreams. And they were not about that. So Joseph's brothers went to pasture their father's flocks at Shechem, but they had been gone a while, so Jacob sent Joseph to find them. Whenever Joseph got over there, a man told him that his brothers had moved down to a place called Dothan. So he then went down to Dothan to look for his brothers, and Joseph's brothers saw him approaching, and they plotted to kill him. They were like, we're not having any more of this favoritism. We're going to get him. So they were going to kill him. They were going to throw him into a cistern, which is basically a hole that is used for water. It's a water tank. So whenever there was rain or floods or whatever, this cistern would hold the water so that they could preserve it for later. So they were going to throw him into this empty cistern. There was no water in there. So Joseph arrived, and the brothers ripped off his robe and threw him into the cistern. But then they thought about it and were like, what good does this do for us? What are we going to benefit from this? So they actually decided to sell him to the Ishmaelite traders for their own gain. They sold him for 20 pieces of silver, which I looked it up, and it says it's equivalent to about $190 to $200 USD today, which I'm sure $200 USD back in the day was luxurious. So it's hard to tell, comparisons of that, but the brothers killed a young goat and dipped Joseph's robe in its blood and sent the robe to their father to show that he had been destroyed by a wild animal. Jacob was so upset. He mourned very deeply for a long time and refused to be comforted. He was just so upset. So Joseph's on this journey. He was sold to Potiphar. Potiphar worked for Pharaoh. So Pharaoh was the king of Egypt, and Potiphar noticed that the Lord was with Joseph in everything he did, which led him to succeed, so Potiphar made Joseph his personal attendant. Anything that Joseph was told to do was basically turned to gold. Anything he touched was turned to gold, and Potiphar was like, I want some of that in my life, which is why he made him his personal assistant. The Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. Potiphar's wife began to lust over Joseph and demanded he sleep with her. Joseph refused. He was not going to do that. And every day she kept pestering Joseph. And one day she grabbed him by his cloak, and Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand. So she went and told the servants that Joseph tried to rape her and that he left his cloak behind with her. Of course, they believed this because she literally had his cloak in her hand. Potiphar found out and was furious, and Joseph was thrown into prison. There's a bunch of little kids playing outside. It's really cute, so you might hear them. Joseph was thrown into prison. Oh, now I think they're crying now, so maybe they're going to go home. So whenever Joseph was thrown into prison, the Lord was with him, as he has been throughout this whole journey, and Joseph actually became in charge of all the other prisoners and had order over everything that was happening. He was put in charge. And it's just really cool to see in whatever situation he gets in, the Lord is with him. He blesses him and he puts him in this authority position. So, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, which, you read about this story and then I was thinking, what is the purpose of a cupbearer? And it's someone who serves wine to the king, which I think is so wild because I don't know of anyone who just serves people drinks besides waitresses and waiters, I guess, which I guess it could be kind of like that. But anyways, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended him, and they were thrown into prison where Joseph was also in charge of them. They both had dreams one night, and Joseph saw that they looked upset about the dreams that they had. They were kind of distraught and wondering what these dreams meant. So Joseph mentioned, he said, interpreting dreams is God's business, and through God, Joseph was able to interpret their dreams. So what happened in the chief cupbearer's dream was that he saw a grapevine in front of him that had 3 branches, and they began to bud and blossom, and they produced clusters of ripe grapes. He squeezed some of the fresh juice into a cup and placed it into Pharaoh's hand. So Joseph interpreted his dream, and this is what he said. The 3 branches equals 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as cupbearer. Joseph asked to be mentioned to Pharaoh so he could get out of prison. So whenever the cupbearer got back to Pharaoh, he said, please remember me so that I don't have to be stuck here anymore. And then the chief baker was like, ooh, that was a good dream, a good interpretation. Can you interpret my dream? And the chief baker's dream was there were 3 baskets of white pastries stacked on his head. The top basket contained all kinds of pastries for Pharaoh, but the birds came and ate them. So Joseph said that the 3 baskets also equaled 3 days. And in 3 days from now, Pharaoh will lift the chief baker up and impale his body on a pole, and the birds will come and peck away at his flesh. Not such a great interpretation of that dream. And of course, these events happened, and the cupbearer got back into being Pharaoh's cupbearer, and the chief baker was impaled on a pole. The cupbearer did not mention Joseph whenever he got reestablished with Pharaoh. So Joseph continued to stay in jail, and 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream, and the cupbearer remembered, oh my goodness, I never told Pharaoh about how Joseph interpreted my dream. And so he told him about this, and then Pharaoh called for Joseph to interpret his dream. And his dream was There were 7 healthy cows and 7 healthy heads of grain, which represented 7 years of prosperity. And then he dreamed 7 thin, scrawny cows and 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind, which represented 7 years of famine. So there would be 7 years of prosperity and 7 years of famine following after that. So Pharaoh needed to make a plan to have an intelligent and wise man to be in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Pharaoh was advised that he should appoint supervisors to collect a fifth of the crops during the 7 good years, or else the famine will completely destroy and wipe out the land. Pharaoh realized Joseph's interpretations and saw he was a man of God and thought, okay, you know what? I'm putting you in charge. And these exact events took place and they happened. So there started to be a famine. Jacob, Joseph's father, heard that grain was available in Egypt, and so he sent his sons down there, except he did not send the youngest son, Benjamin, because he didn't want him to get harmed in any way. So the brothers came down to Egypt to collect some grain, and they were represented to Joseph. Joseph recognized them immediately, but he pretended not to, and he actually spoke pretty harshly to them. Joseph accused, and I put quotation marks if you're not watching, he accused them of being spies scouting the land. And he wanted to test them a little bit. So he said to leave one of their brothers and take grain home to their starving families and to bring back their youngest brother that was left behind. And then Joseph will know that they are not spies. So whenever they got there, Joseph was hounding them about their family. He asked about his father and if he was still alive, and then he asked how many people were in the family. And once he got all that information, even though he already knew, obviously, but he couldn't let them know that, he said, okay, leave me with one of your brothers, which they left Simon, and I need you to bring back Benjamin, and then I will know you are not spies. But go ahead and take the grain back to your families so that they can have that. So they went back, they told their father Jacob about all of this, and when they got back, they took out their sacks that had their money in it, and they realized that the money they paid for the grain was in their sacks again. So they did pay for the grain, but then they realized it was refilled back to as if they had never spent any money. So they got so scared because they thought, oh no, we're going to get accused of stealing. How did this even get in here? But what had happened was Joseph had secretly had his servants put the money back in their sacks because he wanted it to be a test of integrity, an act of mercy, and a way to stir reflection and repentance. So he wanted to see first if they were going to say anything about the money at all. And then he wanted to show mercy. He knows that he doesn't need to be the one to give justice, but God does. And so he wanted to show mercy to his brothers. And he wanted them to really think, reflect, and repent for what they had done in the past. And so we don't know how much time passed before they actually went back, but they ran out of grain, so they knew that they needed to go back to Egypt to get more. So meanwhile, Simon's still there, and it is guessed that it was a few months, maybe a year before they had gone back to get more grain. Just thinking about how much grain would keep them alive. You know, we eat 3 times a day, so how much grain did they actually take? And then how long did it take for them to get through all of that grain before they had to go out? It's hard to guess. That's not something that's very clear in the Bible, but I would say a few months to potentially a year is what is estimated. So anyways, this time Jacob said, I want you to bring him some gifts. So he packed up some balm, honey, gum, aromatic resin, pistachio nuts, and almonds. He was like, bring this to Joseph, which he didn't know was Joseph. He said, double the money in your sacks, so I need you to bring back what was in there and then another portion of that. And we are going to give you Benjamin too. Jacob was hesitant to give them Benjamin, but Judah promised. He said, I will take care of him. He will be back. Don't worry. And so they went on their way back to Egypt. And whenever they got there, they were nervous because they thought they were going to be accused of stealing, but then the servants were like, no, we know you paid for it. It's okay. Don't worry about it. And they actually got invited to a feast at Joseph's palace because at this point, this was another one of Joseph's tests. And he's like, okay, they're passing the test. Joseph saw that they had brought Benjamin, and he was filled with so many emotions. He wept and went into a private room and was so overwhelmed. And I think whenever I was reading through my notes in my Bible, I put on the side that it's really good to take a moment and feel our emotions, let them come over us. And sometimes if we need to step away and do that, that's totally fine. But then after he went into a private room and wept, he came back out, he had his composure, and he was ready to continue. And I think that's such a good reminder because we can take some time to feel our emotions. We have our emotions for a reason, but then we have to come back and compose ourselves and continue on with our lives. And that's what he did. So the brothers bowed down to Joseph as was predicted in his dream. And they had a feast, and then after they were eating, Joseph sent them on their way, but he wanted to do one more test. And he had his own personal silver cup, and he secretly told his servant to place it in Benjamin's grain sack. And the reason he did this was because he wanted to see if his brothers had truly changed, and they wanted to see if they would abandon his brother or if they would protect him. On their way, they were stopped and accused of stealing the cup, and they were so flabbergasted and confused. No, we didn't take this. What are you talking about? They said, go ahead and check our bags. We didn't take anything. And then, of course, they found the silver cup in Benjamin's bag, even though he didn't put it there. And so here's the test of loyalty. Were they just going to abandon him? Because the men said, we won't blame all of you. We will just blame the one who actually stole the cup. And so this was a perfect opportunity for them to stick by their brother's side, but Joseph wanted to see if they would just abandon Benjamin. And Judah was the one who spoke up because he said, you know what? I told my dad I would stand up for Benjamin. And he promised his father that he would bring him back. And after all of that, Joseph realized, okay, they all passed the test. And so I'm going to reveal my identity. And he told them, he said, don't be upset and angry with yourselves for selling me to this place because it was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives, which I've read this story so many times, but I don't think I ever realized the depth of it. If Joseph was not sold into slavery, then he would have never had all of this authority with Pharaoh, and he wouldn't have been able to provide the grain for them to live. So if Joseph was never sold into slavery, they probably would have died in the famine. So it just shows that God can take something evil and turn it for good, which we're going to continue to get into that. And so Pharaoh says, hey, bring your dad out to Egypt. So the sons go and return the good news to Jacob. They let him know that Joseph is still alive, and he is shocked and ecstatic, and he's like, wow, okay. So he gets to go and sees Joseph, and it's just an emotional thing. And some time passes by. Jacob is entering his last few days on earth because he's getting old. And he told Joseph to bring his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, so he could bless them. And so he did that. And then after that, he gathered all of his sons together and he blessed them each individually with an appropriate message. Some of the blessings were honestly not that great, but it just reflected how they lived their lives. And then others were great blessings. And then Jacob had passed and was buried. And instantly the brothers felt fearful because they thought that Joseph would now show his anger and pay back. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. So it all comes for full circle. And Joseph ended up living until the age of 110, and he lived to see 3 generations of Ephraim and the birth of the children of Manasseh's son Machir. So that is the story of Joseph, and I think it's such a really great story because there's so many things that happen. There's so much repentance and redemption and grace and mercy and love in this entire story. And I think it just goes to show how important it is to let God be in control of everything, because I'm sure that if this was to happen to any of us, it would be such a hard position to be in because we know we didn't do anything wrong, but now we're suffering in this position. But he truly made the most of it, and God blessed him in everything that he did. Even when he was in prison, he was put in charge of everybody, and he followed out the Lord's plan, and ultimately it saved his life because he would have most likely died in the famine. And so you never know what God can do, and you never know how he can use evil for good. And I think a lot of the times we can reflect on the evil things that other people do, or even the things of our past, and we just think, man, there's no redemption in that because I've already crossed this line, or I already made these mistakes. But no, there's so much redemption in that, and God really wants to use that. And what a cool story to share with other people so that they don't experience the same things that you had to go through. And so I think there's so many lessons in all of that, and it's really cool to see how God can work in so many different situations. So I think this week, just reflecting on areas of your life where maybe you feel like you've messed up, or maybe somebody has done you wrong, and instead of feeling bitter and spiteful about either your own sin or someone else's sin, ask God, how can this be used for good? And do I need to repent? And do I need to have a conversation with somebody? Because you ultimately can't control what other people can do, but you can control what you do, and you can control how you let your thoughts run in your mind. Essentially, I know sometimes we get bombarded with lots of wild thoughts in our minds, but we do have the right to take our thoughts captive and give them to God. And if we're in a not so great situation, we can ask God for guidance in how we can use this situation for good, because that's all He wants to do. He wants to bring lots of love and grace and redemption in our lives. And I think we should let Him. Why would we want to rob Him of that? I think it's such a good story, and it's one of my favorites. And so I'm really excited that I got to share that with you guys. So next week will be week 6, and we are going to talk about Esther. I also love the story of Esther. I just love learning all these different stories, and I love when they're ingrained in my brain because they're just great references to look back to. And whenever I'm going through something hard, I can think, oh man, Joseph went through this in a similar way, or David went through this, or Esther went through this. And so it's really good to know these stories, have them in your heart so that you can also teach them to the people that you love and all of that. So thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing with me for not having an episode last week, but this week you get 2, so that's pretty cool. Anyways, I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you next week.